good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Avi Stamen, and I am the CEO of Academic Language Experts. Thanks for joining us today for our publication success interview, this time with a special guest panel. This is the 8th month in a row where I've had the privilege of speaking with innovative thought leaders across the world of academia about how they're influencing academic publication in the hopes of creating a bridge between authors and publishers. I'm delighted today to be joined by 3 special guests. Katie Stileman from Princeton University Press, Michael Willis from Wiley, and Duncan Nicholas, who is the president of the European Association of Science Editors. So quickly about our special guest today. Katie is the head of Princeton's PUP Speaks, which is a new venture from Princeton University Press. She previously worked on the marketing and publicity teams for both trade and academic publishers. She's worked for Penguin, Random House, Routledge, Oxford University Press, and MIT Press. So really any questions about any kind of book you might want to publish should be turned to her. She loves meeting academics that are at the intersection between their research and public interest, whether that's through media exposure, speaking opportunities, or grassroots collaborations with invested partners. Michael Willis. So Michael is joining us. Michael has a background in history and in ancient history and literature, and he started his publishing career with Catchword, publishing online journals for scholarly publishers. He joined Blackwell Publishing in 2005, managing journal editorial offices in the health sciences. His remit expanded in 2014 to oversee Wiley's editorial office in the UK, managing the development and implementation of peer review best practices across all discipline and peer review models. So if you've ever been frustrated by peer review, Michael is your man. Since 2009, he has been he's the research advocate at Wiley, exploring how publishers can best meet the needs and aspirations of researchers as editors, reviewers, and authors in the submission and peer review process. So there is someone working on this field. Michael was the president of the International Society of Managing and Technical Editors in 2016 and 2017. Michael, thank you for joining us today. Duncan Nicholas, last but not least, Duncan is our third and final panelist. He's the director, he's both the president of EASE, the European Association of Science Editors, as well as the director of DN Journal Publishing Services. He has over 16 years experience in journal publishing in the industry and is the president of EASE. He's also a trainer for the Association of Learning, Publishing, and Society Professionals, ALPSP for short, not so short, delivering their advanced journal development course. In 2017-2018, he chaired the conference organizing committee for the International Society for Managing and Technical Editors and is currently an active member of the Peer Review Week organizing committee. My problem with reading the bios is that people are always way too accomplished and it makes me feel much more insecure about myself, but I'm happy that we have such talented guests with us today. Duncan provides independent editorial consultancy, supporting publishers and journals with editorial strategy and development, editorial board recruitment, peer review workflows, and configurations, among many other aspects of publishing. Some would call him the publishing Wizard of Oz. He also provides training courses to publishers, researchers, and the wider scholarly community with clients around the world in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and North America. We urge you not to be shy and feel free to chime in with your questions in the chat throughout the session. We will be addressing all of the questions, or as many as we can, at the end of the session in a Q&A, so we might not get to it right away during the session, but we will try to get to as many as possible. If you have a more personal question, feel free to reach out to us individually. We'll have a screen up with all of our information immediately following the interviews or the panel. I want to, but you're welcome to write on the chat at any point. Yes, one more important point is that this interview the panel is being recorded, so you don't need to write down notes. That's number one. And number two is if you do want to share it with other colleagues, or if you want to rewatch it at a later point, you're welcome to do so. Right, but one more thing before we kick off the event, I just want to share a word about the company that I run, Academic Language Experts. If you're not familiar, ALE for short, we provide customized translation, editing, and academic support services to researchers, scientists, and other professionals to help them produce publication-ready texts at the highest levels. We also help scholars looking for help polishing their book proposals prior to submission to their dream publisher. We're grateful and proud to have helped scholars translate, edit, and prepare their research in over 50 languages. Articles and books we have worked on have been published with top academic publishers, including, of course, Princeton and Wiley. It's our mission to help our authors achieve publication success and be a source of guidance and support along their journey. And now, with great excitement and no further ado, I want to introduce you to Katie, Michael, and Duncan. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to chat with me today.
Oh yeah, pleasure. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So okay. So I want to get started, and I want to. I actually want to ask for the audience participation here. I think that the last year and a half has been quite, in every sense of the word, has been quite a transformation and upheaval, I guess, in many different ways, and has impacted people in different ways. And today our real goal is to explore how that has impacted the world of academic publishing. So what I want to ask everyone to do before I ask our panelists to chime in is I want everyone just to take a second and if you have had an experience publishing in the last year and a half, something that has to do with your experience publishing during COVID that is unique, or that you've noticed some sort of change or trend, just jot it down in the chat, because I'm curious to hear. I know I've heard from authors, sort of different things about what their experience has been over the last year and a half. But I'm curious if that holds true for others as well. So I'll give everyone about 30 seconds to do that, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I see that a number of people have noted the how long it's taken, which I wonder if that's, I'm sure that's very much true, and maybe we've forgotten and gotten nostalgic about the fact that it always took a very long time. Maybe it takes a very, very long time. So, all right, that seems to be the overwhelming reaction. So,
because we're all doing more webinars, we're all here talking.
Yeah, exactly. We're all here and not responding to journals. All right, so maybe we'll try and address that at some point during the discussion. I think that's an important point. All right, so let's start, Katie. Let's start with you. Can you just tell us, and really this question is directed to all of you, but we'll start with you, Katie. Can you tell us, about personally, what was your job before COVID came along, and is it the same as? Are you doing the same thing now as you did then? And if not, what sort of evolution has occurred in what it is that you're doing personally?
That's great. Thanks, Avi. I've actually got two perspectives on this, because I started the COVID era working in publicity. And so that meant that my job sort of pivoted to comforting traumatized authors who were watching their carefully curated book tours fall apart before their eyes, and having to help them come to terms with the fact that their fascinating and relevant subject was no longer something that people were willing to talk about, that newspapers had space to discuss. When the sort of first impact of COVID came. And then also, on the other hand, working with journalists who were exhausted, overworked, dealing with the pandemic themselves, and having to accept PDFs, many of them for the first time in their lives, as the only way that they were able to review books. But at the same time, as trying to work in sort of post-COVID publicity, I think this is probably a safe enough space to admit that when COVID did first hit, I was already in discussions about my current role, planning this new initiative with Princeton University Press. And just so that you know what I'm talking about for the rest of the discussion, I'm heading up PUP Speaks, which is the first university press speaking agency. And it's a speaking agency that really is focused on the needs of academic authors. And we never thought when we were setting this up initially that we would be able to launch under the circumstances we're now in. We were only thinking in terms of in-person events. We didn't think that virtual events were something that people would be interested in, and least of all that they would be willing to pay large significant fees for. But now, over a year into this job, we offer virtual options as standard, regardless of where in the world the event is taking place or when it's going to be happening, because that's something that audiences are comfortable with now. And in fact, there are some audiences and some organizations that much prefer it due to sort of flexibility, global reach, And of course, it saves on things like T&E. So for me, having gone into events just at a time when the events world seems to be falling apart, it's been fascinating to see how actually things have very much carried on as normal, but just in a virtual sphere.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Katie. Yeah, I think, Katie's really carving out of, if I may say so, a really fascinating niche, which is really trying to provide a microphone to academics who have really interesting research and give them a platform and sort of taking advantage of the fact that we're now in a virtual world to actually make academics' voices be heard in a more diverse and wide way, but also across a greater spectrum of potential listeners and audience, which I think is important. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about your work and what's happened over COVID?
Sure. So my role as research advocate started just before the pandemic, in fact, and I was very much finding my feet in terms of engagement with editors, peer reviewers, authors as researchers. We had quite a lot of person-to-person interaction through things like editorial meetings and so on, and meetings with colleagues, and I was all geared up to go and speak at a conference in Amsterdam, which didn't happen. In fact, it only happened last week online, a year and a half later, and we were going to hold a workshop for early career researchers and that sort of thing. So those all changed and pivoted completely, obviously, as you can imagine. We're a very global company, Wiley, so we have offices literally all over the world. The people I engage with mostly are in the US and in India and Melbourne, actually, in Australia. And in all of those circumstances, nothing's changed really. It's still by video conference. It's still meetings and getting not zoomed out because we use Microsoft Teams. We're sort of teamsed out, if you like, on video calls and all the rest. So I think what I've missed is the interaction, face-to-face interaction with researchers and editors in particular, which I was used to. And there's not really a substitute for that, even through something like Microsoft Teams. The other thing which I've really missed is the chance interaction that you have in a workplace, at a water cooler or in the kitchen or wherever it is, while you're making a coffee. And quite a lot of fruitful discussion, conversation, and ideas can be sparked from that, and you get the creativity of interacting with people in that way, and that's really missing as well in terms of how my work has evolved.
Michael, can you just share a little bit with everyone, because I think the current audience would be really interested, just about what it is like that you do as part in your role with peer review, like specifically in that context, and how you help improve the peer review process?
Yeah, sure. So my role is to keep an eye, if you like, the weather vane for the what's going on in peer review generally, journal peer review. This is not grant peer review or any other sort of peer review that goes on, and to look at initiatives and trends and developments. And I guess I can talk about some of those later, but also to think about how we can make the peer review process the best it can be, in terms of just the quality of feedback that authors get on their manuscripts, the speed I see is a big thing that's come up in the chat, but also compliant with all the right ethical standards, which is really critical. And that can be done in different ways. So one of the things I might talk about later is about the interplay of technology to support editors and peer reviewers in the peer review process. And there are lots of exciting trends happening at the moment in rethinking how we do peer review. So what I'm doing is trying to map that back onto what we do at Wiley, and to see how we can evolve to meet those sort of community demands and expectations.
Great, brilliant. Thanks so much, Michael. Duncan, tell us a bit about your work. I know you have a number of different hats, so I don't know if we can cover them all, but just tell us a bit about how what you do and how that's changed over COVID.
Yeah, well, part of my work has remained quite similar, and the other part has changed completely. And both things touch on things Katie and Michael have mentioned. The majority of my work is with editorial development consultancy. Previously was conducted from my home office, which you can see behind me. Anyway, so in terms of my working environment, that hasn't changed too much. And I tend to spend a lot of time on my computer running reports, analysing data, which is quite a solitary sort of task, writing reports. But then I have to present them, take them to editors, discuss them with their publishers, particularly for contract bids, contract tenders. That's always involved meetings in person. So those have now all been conducted online. So even though my environment hasn't changed, I have had to adapt to other people changing their environments and being taken out of their work-related comfort zones, which has actually been quite a profound change for me, the way I kind of interact with people, or sometimes people have really not been comfortable working from home, and I fully sympathize, because it took me a lot of time and kind of effort to create my home office environment, and working from a kitchen counter is really not the same, like kind of with a laptop precariously propped up on something that was never designed to be worked from. So that's definitely been something that I've taken into consideration in my relationships and adapted to try and help people with, which kind of segues into the other part of my work, which is a lot of training for researchers. So previously I was going to universities or publishing houses all around the world. Now that's completely been done online. And the online training environment, as many people probably know already, is completely different to an in-person training environment. The tasks we're able to do are completely different, the interactions that we can have. And even the time of a training session online is strangely elastic. Like awkward pauses in person, you could just gloss over them, but online, when you struggle to think for something, it feels like it takes hours, just stretches out. It's really uncomfortable. And a 20-minute task feels like a matter of moments. It's over really quickly. So those are kind of things that I've had to adapt to and learn a lot of new techniques and ideas for really being able to deliver the same qualities of training and help participants get the same results and learn similar things. There are some different tools as well people have needed to learn or been able to learn as well through those training sessions. But in a nutshell, those are some of the key changes that I've experienced.
Got it. Well, thank you first of all to all of you for sharing your personal experiences. I want to bring up and maybe we'll start with you, Michael. I want to bring up two issues. One that was that a number of people brought up in the chat, and that is just a delay. Which and I'm hoping, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm hoping that you can maybe give an insight into what the publishing process looks like and why maybe that delay occurred, and whether we expect that to be fixed over or caught up with. That's number one. Number two is there's an irony here, because there's a delay with certain projects, but then there were certain articles that I think were fast tracked. And I was specifically thinking of some of the maybe more medical related articles that needed to be fast tracked in order to get them out for print. And get them out so that they could be used in the field. And that comes with its own challenges, because fast tracking research can also, can also lead to maybe, feeling like there's a need to compromise on the peer review process. So can you speak to maybe some of the biggest challenges that you've experienced over the last, year and a half, or that the publishing world has experienced? And maybe lay them out so that authors in the crowd and academics in the crowd get a better sense of the challenges that you're facing, and what are some of the dilemmas that you have to deal with.
Yeah, sure. And I see that from some of the comments in the chat that we have people who are experienced in peer review and obviously experienced as authors. So you've got those insights already in a sense. But just sort of lifting the lid, as it were, on peer review, it's external peer review, as traditionally and formally done, is done by academics in the field who are invited by the editor of the journal to review an article and it's typically two. It can be single anonymous or double anonymous. In other words, you do or do not know the names of the authors, it's a social phenomenon, peer review, and by that I mean that it's all about people doing the work, and all of the processes are about people's people interacting with other people's work, and it necessarily has a bearing on how. I guess what I'm trying to say is it has a bearing on how people are, or the different pressures and so on that people have in their daily lives. And COVID really brought that to the fore. So whereas before we get frustrated as a publisher that a reviewer might take 3 weeks to review when they've said they would do it in 2 weeks, what we found was that actually those times have changed dramatically. And as you say, for biomedical articles, for example, we wanted ultra rapid turnaround times, and that put pressures on other bits of the system. I think there's not been a uniform challenge in terms of things like publication delay. I won't say publication delay because I think actually the publishing process itself has not changed at all in terms of time. What's changed is the peer review time, and the stresses there have been around well, different things actually. So there's early on in the pandemic, we found that there were some early career researchers who actually had more time on their hands to do things. They couldn't go into their labs to do work. They were stuck at home, as it were. They didn't necessarily have lots of responsibilities in their personal lives to do. And we did get feedback from researchers saying, actually, I've got time on my hands. I'm happy to do more peer reviews than usual. Conversely, we had others who said, I've just got no time at all to do anything beyond look after my family or do the homeschooling or whatever. I can't get to my lab. I can't repeat experiments that reviewers are asking me to do. I can't even do that. There's no way I can do peer review for you. And so what we found in the pandemic was all of those sorts of stresses and strains on people's lives really accentuated in a big way. There were differences in terms of gender. So women we found were more disadvantaged than men, for example, in terms of what they could submit and how they could peer review. We found geographical disparities as well. So in the early days of the pandemic, I was in touch with some editors who are surgeons in Italy who had been co-opted to go and run the accident and emergency departments in their hospitals. They didn't have time to do anything except look after COVID patients for several months. You know, what do you do in a situation like that where you're an author who's keen to get your paper published, but actually there's no one to review it because they're all doing much more critical work in the big scheme of things. And we found differences by stage of research career, if you like. So early career researchers generally had a bit more time on their hands than the senior ones who were perhaps co-opted doing other work. So it's not uniform. But yeah, I could say other things, but I'll leave, you give space to the others if they want to comment and respond as well.
Yeah, Duncan or Katie, did you want to add anything to that?
Near the beginning of that, Michael said that the peer review process was the main thing that had changed, and the publication process didn't change. Though I do know some journals that were not doing kind of rapid publication. And they did start publishing accepted versions immediately after it had been accepted, rather than waiting for a formal article to be published in the issue. So there are kind of increases in the speed in various other aspects all along. And I noticed someone in the chat just mentioned instructors having to prepare online courses, and yeah, that can't really be understated, the amount of work that it takes to transform in-person courses to online courses. It's huge.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and one thing that I think is an interesting thing that I don't know that we need to think about also is what does for that research that did need to get out quickly. I know there were certain cases where, for example, a preprint would go up online, and then a journalist might come along and say, oh, here's some great research, and they would take it and publish it. And then, that would may impact even, field work or practice in hospitals. And then it turned out that once it went through the, the peer review process, it actually maybe had some flaws, and even published articles, were then retracted because they were pushed out quickly. So I think it's sort of, we do want things to go at a good speed, but we also need to be careful of what is the price we pay when we don't wait for that peer reviewer that we really want, and we settle for someone who maybe doesn't have the right experience or background because we want to get it out fast. Or and we'll talk about this a bit later, but does the public or do practitioners have a good enough understanding of the scientific process that publishers go through in order to be able to know at what point can it be verified? Can we consider it verifiable research that can be relied on in the field, and at what point is it too early, or what do we do with preprints, right, that have value and significance but shouldn't be related to the same way that published research has. So I think it's finding this healthy balance between pushing things forward as fast as possible, but not making any mistakes on the way. It sort of reminds me of the question of the vaccines themselves, right? It's like, you want them to move forward as soon as possible, but you also don't want to skip any of the really important and critical checkpoints along the way, which were installed for very good reasons, and are there in order to safeguard against making mistakes.
Yeah, can I comment on that? Actually, I think that's absolutely right, Avi. I think so. When I've thought about this, I've identified 3 areas that I think the whole COVID thing has accelerated. So these are trends that were there before COVID, but we've really seen them accelerated, and COVID's been like a catalyst for change. So the first one, and these 3 things I think are in tension. The first one is about an impatient society. We want everything now and rapid. And, TikTok will now let you do things for 60 seconds. It used to be 15 seconds or something. TikTok is your way of communicating with the world instantly and rapidly, and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and all the rest of it. But we also question truth, and we want some sort of sense of confidence in knowing that what we're reading is true and valid and trustworthy. And we've seen that with things like COVID research, obviously, but, vaccination, mask wearing, transmissibility, all those sorts of things. And then in openness as well, we want transparency about how things are done. So we want the government to be transparent about how it's come to the different policies that it's implementing. And I think that's translated into publishing in different ways. So we've seen the massive rise in preprints and in the profile of preprints in a way that has never been witnessed before. So medRxiv, for example, has rocketed in terms of the number of preprints that have been posted to it. And so there's that rapid, ultra rapid way of getting new research out there. But at the same time, there's got to be more attention given to the importance of formal peer review, because preprints are, and even the preprint servers will make this claim frequently and often, that they are preprints that have not gone through peer review, and researchers still value peer review. So at the same time as everything needs to be getting out there quickly, there's still that sense of, actually, let's hold back a bit. We need to wait. And then the third thing about transparency is that we have seen greater attention, I think, to transparent processes. So open methods, open research, open data, open access, of course, and open peer review. And I think those 3 things in tension is how publishers have been trying to, engage with researchers over the last year and a half.
Great, thank you, Michael. So yeah, Michael, I feel, I get the sense, Michael and Duncan, you have a very, you're coming at it from the, sort of the process and journal side. Katie, I'm curious. I want to kind of flip the question on its head and ask you, from sort of the publicity and side, are there any positive developments that you have, kind of noticed over the last, over the last year and a half, over the last 18 months, that you think are things that, maybe are the result, maybe started before, but have been expedited, or maybe are the result of, of being forced into these situations, but actually are positives that you think that have come out of this that should be sort of, maintained, hopefully when we get back to normal sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks, Michael and Duncan, for your insights. I feel like I'm learning an enormous amount just while I'm sitting here and taking in your thoughts. And I was particularly grateful to hear Michael mention sort of the realization we've all had about our expectations of immediacy in society, and the sort of positive side of that we've seen with people being able to react really quickly and pivot really quickly in some really exciting and unexpected ways. So when I was still at MIT Press, within about a month of the lockdown, we had launched 2 initiatives. We'd launched a sort of rapid reviews initiative, which we did in connection with UC Berkeley to sort of help with the peer review process and build digital tools around that. And then we also launched an initiative called First Reads, which saw sort of mini books being published digitally within a couple of months, all fully peer reviewed. So that important part of the book publishing process was not skipped. But a lot of other parts were to enable for information in book form to become immediately accessible, that we felt was important. That's positive. I'm sure we've all seen digital initiatives that were sort of sluggishly crawling along at our companies suddenly get shoved to the front of the queue and have really positive sort of impacts on our workflows and the way we do management and the way that we store information. That's certainly something that PUP has seen as everyone worked from home at a company that was traditionally very office-based. Now we're much more agile in the way that we're able to work, and that has lots of benefits. But sort of specifically looking at my area of publishing, I think there's sort of two types of impact. There are the impacts that we've seen on the world, right? And then there's impacts that are sort of publishing specific. And impacts that have happened in every industry. One thing that I personally am grateful for was, I'm sorry if this makes me hugely unpopular, was a sort of sudden stop in business travel. Now, I've traveled an enormous amount for work. I used to sort of commute to Boston sort of 12 times a year or something to manage a team out there. And although there was lots that was wonderful about that, there was something about sort of having a sudden and universal stop in business travel that made me realize how sort of personally, but also environmentally unfriendly my lifestyle had been. And I think that's something that we really need to reconsider as we consider the global sort of impact of travel, particularly on the climate. The sort of 2-day transatlantic trip for one business meeting in New York, hopefully, is something that I'd like to see the end of. But I also think that sort of things around well-being and flexibility that might have a really long-term legacy. For all of those who suddenly had to drop everything and prioritize people, whether that's, children, elderly parents, friends, people living alone, their communities, whether that will help us to reprioritize in a way that's actually very helpful. Now that's sort of, much more blue sky thinking. But, if we're looking at changes about the way that we do book promotion, there is a lot that we lost to COVID, and I do miss sort of the warm white wine and the human connection that you got at book launches and at big conferences. But Zoom events have expanded global reach and are inclusive of people who didn't have the liberty of getting to London for an evening event or being able to travel. And that will have a positive impact on women, particularly as sort of still to this day primary caregivers. It will enable more women to participate. And also people who are financially less well-resourced as well. And something that I've been delighted to see is that book readers have shown that they are still willing to listen, and they are still willing to pay for content that they have an interest in. So while many of us, I think, thought that people would be particularly stingy in the COVID era due to sort of economic uncertainty, but also not getting sort of the benefits around things like events of, feeling like you'd had a night out. People are actually still willing to pay to support causes that they care about and to learn about things that they think are important. And then sort of finally, I think from a sort of publishing perspective, we've seen how authors and publishers who are able to work together and to be agile have been hugely successful. And that collaborative work between author and publisher is something that I, as a publicist, was always very keen on, but had seen increase anyway in recent years. That authors no longer think I can just sit back and let my publisher do the work of marketing and publicity. This is something that I need to be engaged in. When the world fell apart around us, that was something that we were able to communicate really well with authors, I think, and that authors have actually really appreciated being more involved in the promotion of their books.
Can I put you just push back for a minute and just ask you to give a specific example? And was there an author that you came across that just did a really brilliant job of doing this, or was there an idea or an initiative that really just pushed a book and made it, a popular, that in the last year and a half that you can share with us that you think is like maybe a source of inspiration or a model that can be replicated?
Yeah, I mean, so sort of the immediate book that I can use as an example is I was the lead publicist on a book called The Alchemy of Us by an author called Anissa Ramirez. She's an amazing science communicator. So, of course, that's very relevant sort of more broadly for some of the topics we'll come on to later. And we had planned a global book tour for her that was cancelled in its entirety. And one thing that was great about Anissa, who had always been very engaged. So I'm not sure she's a great example of someone who sort of, came up to the plate unexpectedly. We always knew that she was willing to collaborate with us. But she also didn't have a hissy fit about the fact that her sort of carefully planned book tour had absolutely been destroyed. Instead, she said, right, what can I do now? And how can I make your lives easier? Because I know that you're all coping with this in much the way that I am. And what that did look like initially was a lot of her events going straight online, and that was great. It was the very early stages of Zoom being sort of a universal language, but it was very successful. But also she was willing to think about other groups that she might be able to reach, whether that was school kids that she was now able to give talks to that she wouldn't have been able to before. She did a lot of writing actually for the publishing media. So we had she was a book author in science, so we'd put a lot of stuff in the science media, but she then said, what can I do to communicate about my experience of having a book come out right at the beginning of COVID? And so she did a lot of writing and pitched that herself when we were sort of struggling to make the changes that would allow us to pitch them for her. And she's also very active on social media, but changed the way that she was communicating from being directly promotional to being much more holistic, engaging with people about how they were finding sort of the impact of science suddenly being all that anyone was talking about, and their kind of understanding of that. So she was available, and I think there would have been lots of authors who just had to drop everything and go and, like you say, man their hospitals or man their new homeschooling regime. But I think that authors who are willing to talk and actually ask a publisher, look, what are you not able to do that I can do, makes a huge difference, because there just has to be an understanding that many hands make light work, and that a publisher has limited resources and will do what they see as being the biggest priority. But if there are things that an author is either able to help with or perhaps better positioned to do than the publisher, that can be a really fruitful partnership. Yeah.
One of the first things whenever I speak to anyone and give them some advice on preparing their proposal for a book, for a publisher, is to, do a brainstorming session about who are, in broad terms, who are the potential interested readers in your book. And you may think, well, that's the publisher's job, is to find who's going to read the book. But actually, as the author themselves, you most likely are in the circles of those, people. So it could be specific university libraries and specific departments. It could be museums. It could be professional institutions that you're a part of that have a vested interest in the specific topic. It can be many of those, and I think that it's really interesting what you're saying, Katie, because I know that sometimes academics have this, and understandably they have this, approach of, okay, I finished my book, I've handed it off, now it's your job. Like, that's what you do, right? That's what you're good at. But actually collaborating on that, especially now when there are no, trade shows to show the book off at, can actually be really impactful and make the difference between, first of all, of having the publisher interested in the manuscript in the first place, meaning it could actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, that can influence whether a publisher is even going to take interest in a book, is the ability to then market and get that book out there without the shows to be able to do that. And then once it is accepted, to really turn it from just, having a pretty book, which is nice and important, but actually make the impact that you want it to make by getting it out to the audiences that you want to get it out to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say sort of one more thing now before you move the discussion on, Abby, but this was a trend that was happening anyway. So I started out in medicine book marketing at OUP sort of over a decade ago. And when I was in that space, there was no expectation that the authors would take any interest in their book's promotion. And if they did, we were almost sort of a bit startled and sometimes distressed that they were trying to do our jobs for us. Within 10 years, that has absolutely done a 180. And now if an author doesn't show enthusiasm for the promotion of their book, we sort of tend to follow their lead, that they're not particularly interested in its success. Now, that doesn't mean we expect every author to be out wearing a sandwich board doing their own publicity, but what it does mean is that we want to be showing sort of an understanding that there is a limit to a publicist or a marketer's time, that they might have 200 books to work on a year, and that by helping with the positioning and by doing things like coming up with some areas where they might be able to contribute, or some ideas that the publisher might want to follow up on, will stand them in really good stead. I think we've probably taken a bit of a turn between that being seen as something that would make you be considered pushy to something which would be very welcome. But that's because there's also, I think, sort of more of a hands-on approach by most people doing their own publicity, whether that's a CEO or an Instagram influencer. We understand that there is, the personal, the authentic is often better than the corporate. And that's something that, it has been massively sped up by COVID, and which I'm quite pleased about.
Nice. Thanks so much, Katie. We've got like way too many topics left for the time that we have. So let's try and keep it short and concise, but there's a few important points that I really want to hit. Duncan, I'm curious if you yourself experienced or saw any research which discussed, just the quantity of submissions over COVID. My anecdotal feeling and experience in speaking with authors and speaking with publishers is that the number of submissions went up quite significantly, especially in the first few months. So do you have any experience or insight to share about that? And if that's true, do you think that, does that make it more difficult to publish nowadays? And if so, how should authors sort of react to the fact that they're just now, maybe the competition is even tighter, and how they should approach that?
Yes, I mean, certainly all of the journals that I've been working with over the last 2 years, pandemic period, have experienced increases in submissions for two reasons. The first is the additional COVID papers and the volume of COVID papers. With so much, research is incremental anyway, but the need or the desire for people to have results as fast as possible meant that there was a lot more kind of incremental knowledge of papers being published straight away as quickly as possible with the provisional results, then with the more extensive results, and then a summary of a wider research program. So that's kind of snowballed the number of articles. I think we're at the point of there's over 100,000 COVID papers have been published in the last 18 months. So I think around there. And the other factor in increasing in submissions is the kind of desk drawer theory that people have had of all the research that has been unable to be finished, that's in the bottom of people's drawers, and whose labs were closed because they couldn't do any new work. They could finish off lots of papers that haven't been finished writing, which AV is a topic that's kind of dear to our hearts, I think. Very conscious of the paper that we still need to finish writing that we started during the pandemic. So yes, there's lots of extra papers that have been finished off over time and submitted. So what that means for future authors now coming out, I guess, of the initial intensity of the pandemic is journals still have their original aims and scope. They're still intending to publish work around the areas that they set out to. So that hasn't changed. So as kind of all that dust settles on all of those papers, they'll still be there wanting new research, and ultimately they'll pick up where they left off before the pandemic hit. And it's not so much a case of competitiveness for that increased number of articles, because we've already seen some reduction in those additional papers, but not to a lower level than they were before. So yeah, there is a bit of a case of picking up where they left off. I don't know if Michael can speak to that from your experiences at Wiley.
Yeah, very much the same as what you say. I think one of the dynamics that's changed has been the need actually to, or the policy that editors have had around what they do with all these submissions. So with a massive increase in submissions, and I mean, 20, 30%, 40% maybe in 2020, different publishers have reported different rates, but they're telling roughly the same story. Editors have decided in some cases to increase their rejection rate and say, we just can't handle this stuff. Let's just be more stringent about how we handle acceptances. I'm not convinced that changing the goalposts in that way is necessarily the best for science. Others have said, okay, we've got this challenge. What do we do about it? Let's refer articles to other journals in a network. So there's an opportunity for sending articles off to other journals that they've got some sort of partnership with. What I think is missing from a lot of the debate about this is how you increase the diversity of your reviewer pool and seize this as an opportunity, not to say let's just overburden the existing pool of reviewers, but let's go to new people, let's go to early career researchers, let's go to underrepresented groups in STM publishing, for example, and STM research. That there's evidence after evidence that shows that there's a massive imbalance in how much output authors are doing compared with how much reviewing those same researchers are doing as peer reviewers. It's predominantly white Western, and that needs and senior researchers, that needs to change. We've got to do something about that. And I think, again, sort of another catalyst for change has been the whole diversity movement that really rose to the fore in 2020 through things like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, all that sort of stuff. This is an opportunity that journals and editors absolutely need to seize on to deal with this. Sorry, that's slightly tangential to your original question, but it's something that
it does speak to it in part, and also as you say, some of the trends that were increasing before or developing before COVID, things like an awareness of the diversity of the demographics of journals, who the contributors are, some of that because of the increase in submissions over that period and the factors that could be assessed against that. And there's been plenty of papers on diversity, demographics. Someone in the chat did ask a question about the demographics of who contributes to journals, who does the reviewing. And we do have some papers, some research has been published on that, finding out who those people are. There are some kind of limitations because of GDPR and the type of data you can gather and analyze on people. But even with that in mind, there are kind of research groups, peer review research group consortia, trying to find out that kind of information. because it's quite valuable when we discover that, yes, women and families are impacted the most in situations like this. And that has implications for the types of people that are doing the reviewing and submitting the papers, the type of perspectives and interpretations and analysis that you're getting out of things. So it can really start to skew results and what's being published. So it is important to
yeah, I mean, I can add, from a language perspective, I know, there has been research that's been put out, and we actually put out a report about linguistic bias, and do reviewers, when they're going through a paper that's maybe not written in the English they're used to, or maybe even include some grammatical errors and mistakes, do they look at it with a different eye than, and not out of any, I don't think it's out of any intentional biases. I think it's just, sort of, subconsciously how we think about how, when we're reviewing a paper, where the individual is from and how that may impact our, they may be using different language. They maybe have different cultural idioms that they use. And yeah, I'm happy to share that report. I'll send that around in an email afterwards. I do want to touch on, which I think it will be our last topic, because we really are running out of time. And our last topic is really talking about what to me was sometimes shocking, sometimes disturbing, sometimes enlightening, the question of how science is perceived in the general public. I think one of the biggest surprises for me over this time is just how, maybe I grew up in a very, in a bubble, so to speak, but I didn't think that, basic notions of scientific theory were so heated in public debate and public discourse. I thought they were sort of a given. And I think that one of the things that I've learned is that maybe, as researchers, we're generally surrounded by other researchers who respect and appreciate and, and understand that the scientific method, whatever it is in our field, is a good way at arriving at the conclusions that we want to arrive at. But the general public may not, there are obviously large swaths of the public that are very much like that, but there are also significant, portions of the public who may be skeptical of science, or may not properly understand what scientific method includes. So I'm curious to hear from all of you. And again, I'm sorry, we don't have that much time. So, but to hear from all of you, sort of, what's your insight into, how science has been perceived in the public sphere over the last 18 months, and maybe what science or what we can do as researchers to help, promote the, and educate really about the importance of science in making policy decisions and, and in our lives. I know it's a big question.
Well, it is a big question. It's a great question. I mean, it's a similar topic. We had a similar topic at the EASE conference in June, which kind of finished. That was the closing session of the conference, and it was very electrifying, very heated as well, as you can imagine. I think in the UK, we had Brexit, part of which the campaign for that was involved in undermining the concept of expertise, able to achieve winning the votes for that. That has had some serious implications, I think. And similarly in the US as well, the Trump administration played a bit into that kind of heart over mind being more kind of important, or giving the notion that people can choose their own sort of realities almost. And that's had quite a significant impact in the way in which scientific advice has been received and implemented and responded to during this pandemic. I think it's a very partisan issue and politicized issue.
Michael, I think you're on mute. It looks like you want to contribute, but it looks like you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, rookie error there. I think publishers have a responsibility to work with science and science communicators around this, and I think we do. There are journalists who are very scrupulous about their interaction with research. There's one that I respect enormously who's a journalist on the BBC Newsnight programme. She's a former editor of the British Medical Journal, so she knows her stuff, and she is scrupulous in fact-checking and communication. I think, there's always this tendency, you hear what you want to hear, and how you bridge that gap is really complex, actually. And so, you can communicate all you like to whoever you want to, but if they're going to drown you out with their groupthink, then that's what they do. It's really tough. So there's a responsibility on the one hand from publishers, preprint service as well. They've got the disclaimers on there saying this is not peer reviewed. This is not a peer review refereed preprint. So please be careful with it. But there's only so much we can do. I mean, Katie is probably the expert here on communications and so on. So I'd love to hear her views on this.
I'm not sure about that, Michael, but I think one thing that I've been mulling over recently is actually off the back of a book that PUP recently published called Breaking the Social Media Prism by a guy called Chris Bale, who's the director of the Polarization Lab at Duke University. Something that has sort of hit me sideways and made me really rethink about what our role as publishers and indeed human beings is that his research shows how social media polarization works, how social media contributes to that, and how online spaces contribute to that. And some of his research is absolutely breathtaking. Particularly one fact that I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to ask you to all go watch one of his talks because that might have a sort of slightly corrected version of what I'm going to say. But something like only 7% of Twitter users get 90% of our attention. So the tweets, 90% of what we see on Twitter comes from 7% of the users. And those 7% are the most vocal and the most extreme in their views. And I think what that shows, isn't it, is that as people who are leading this discussion, we have to take it offline some of the time. A book is a great way to do that. When you read a book, you're much more considered than when you're flicking through your timeline on Facebook or your feed on Twitter, because you have to take the time to do it. You have to disconnect from people's reactions and their comments. That's something that we can vitally do as publishers, is provide another space for people to think. But we also can't fall into the traps that some of those journalists that we love working with do of sensationalizing our content. I, as a publicist, can't be tempted to grab the biggest headline with the Daily Mail that might get the most eyes on my article, but not sell the book itself, just because it makes me look good as a publicist. I have to think actually what's going to get this research out there. And sometimes that means doing the hard work of thinking what of our work is most effective, what of our marketing is most effective in reaching the right people who need this message, as much as it is making money or getting hits on our marketing campaigns. That takes a lot of strategy and a lot of thinking and a lot of stepping back. And that's something I think as publishers we need to do, is step back and think, okay, if we say we're about truth, what does that look like with our marketing and publicity?
Some of that, I think, is reflected in one of the aspects at the root of those kind of Brexit and Trump strategies, which is, I think, valuable lesson to learn and to consider is that concept of elitism and condescension that can be characteristic of communicating science between other scientists. And for them, it's efficient to speak in this kind of local language with acronyms, shorthand terms, abbreviation, because it is more effective and efficient. But you have to choose your language, you have to adapt your messages to different audiences. And that does take a lot of specific skills and abilities to be able to do that, to avoid conveying kind of sense of superiority or belittling people. And that is quite important, and changing the context in which science is talked about. And before before the pandemic for quite a few years, actually. I'm not sure how many years it ran, but there was an initiative called A Pint of Science. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that, which was effectively researchers doing gigs in pubs around the UK. I think mostly London, but maybe Manchester, some other places. Just talking about their research in a pub, really informal, really casual, and very, very accessible. So removing all of that academia as much as possible. So that's kind of another example, as well as being conscious of kind of social media use and adapting voices there to doing more in person, different kind of ways of communicating there.
That's really great. I sort of feel like we could probably have an entire discussion about this topic as well is a really fascinating one, which I'm sure also our audience, everyone has had to contend with it in different ways as well. I do want to wrap things up, only because I want to honor people's schedules and the fact that they've already taken a really nice chunk out of their day to join us. But before we do go, I would just want to quickly share. First of all, upcoming event. This is coming up. We've got 2 events coming up in the months of September, October. We have an event every month, so stay tuned. Always worth checking it out. Coming up in September, it's actually 2 weeks from now, so quick turnaround on this one. We're hosting Bruce Wilson, who is the chief editor at The Conversation. If you're not familiar with The Conversation, definitely go check it out. He's going to talk to us about how to turn research into compelling news stories, and that's really his expertise. He's been doing this for many, many years. He's the former chief editor at the Times of Higher Education, so really knows this field very well. And then in the month of October, we'll have another 3-person panel to discuss trying to bring your book out of beyond the ivory tower, exploring the trend of academic writing of brainy nonfiction, meaning sort of more popularized academic books and what that looks like. We've got other events coming up later, so do feel free to register and chime in and tune in to those events. We would be happy to have you. In addition, I want to invite everyone to follow up with us. We probably do not have time to address, we definitely don't have enough time to address the comments and questions, all of them that were raised today in the chat. But all of our information is here on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us via email, via Twitter. We're all fairly active there. If you have any follow-up questions, if you are looking for any help with your research, whether it's on the language side, so that's translation or editing, or on the consultation side. So if you're looking for help with putting together your book proposal and making it more appealing for publishers, or if you're just looking for general help trying to publish your article, don't hesitate to be in touch. Reach out, send me an email, and I'd be happy to discuss with you. So Michael, Duncan, and Katie, I really, really want to thank you. I really appreciated your insights today. Like I said, I think we could have gone on for another couple hours. Really fascinating discussion. And it really, you kind of complemented each other, because each one of you kind of comes from at it from a different perspective. And I'm sure that the attendees, those who did come and watch today also have their own sort of perspectives and experiences. And it's important sometimes to realize that, others are experiencing, sometimes in similar ways, but sometimes in very different ways, and to make ourselves more empathetic by trying to understand, the different ways about it. So thanks again to everyone for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.